9 habits every Stoic should avoid in their life. What drags you down without you notice? There are things that knock us off balance without making a sound. There are falls that begin with small gestures, silent routines, repeated thoughts we don't question. It's not always the storm that brings us down. Sometimes it's a habit that seems harmless but slowly drags us away from who we are. Stoicism, so often misunderstood as rigidity or indifference, is actually a gentle art, the art of noticing what governs us without our knowledge, of observing the impulses that guide us like invisible threads, and with gentleness and firmness, learning to cut them. Seneca said that the first sign of wisdom is knowing what to avoid, not what to accumulate, not what to display, but what to leave behind. And this requires a rare sensitivity, because there are habits that seem to be part of who we are, but are actually old burden. They are emotional adaptations we made to survive, but which now prevent us from living with wholeness. We react without thinking, seek attention without realizing, flee from silence as if it were a threat. And all of this shapes a version of ourselves that seems strong, but is always on the verge of exhaustion. Epictetus, with his relentless lucidity, said, "You are free, but you live as a servant to your impulse." And perhaps this is the hardest pain to name, knowing deep down that something is wrong, but being unable to explain what. The world around seems normal, but the soul is restless. Routine continues, but the heart feels heavy, like a drifting ship that hasn't realized its lost rudder. The winds aren't the problem, neither are the waves. The problem is no longer knowing where we are going, or worse, pretending we know to avoid stopping and facing the void. But it is precisely there that Stoicism becomes a refuge. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it invites us to look within with sincerity, to identify the habits that, even silently, are distancing us from our emotional dignity. It invites us to choose with more presence, to respond with more awareness, to live with more truth. Because being strong in the Stoic sense isn't enduring everything without complaining. It's refusing to carry what no longer serves. And this begins when we courageously recognize what has been dragging us down, even without notice. 1. Reacting on autopilot and calling it authenticity. How many times have you responded without thinking and later regretted it? How many times did you believe you were being true when in fact you were just pouring out what hurt, unfiltered, undirected, unconsciously? We live in an era that romanticizes impulsivity, that confuses transparency with emotional discharge. But not everything that comes out of us is just an expression of unresolved who we are, masked insecurity, an old pattern that made us believe reacting is proof of authenticity, but it isn't. A Stoic doesn't repress. They choose. They observe the internal movement before transforming it into words, just action. They know that between impulse and response lies an interval, and it is there, in that interval, that freedom begins. Because reacting without pause is to remain governed by the same old impulse. It's responding to the world as if we were still trapped in the past, as if we still needed to attack, flee, prove ourselves. But when we learn to pause, to listen, to breathe before reacting, something changes. Anger loses its strength. Fear gains a name. Confusion transforms into clarity. Seneca, with a precision that time cannot weaken, said, "Anger is a brief madness, and any madness, however fleeting, can destroy what we took so long to build, a relationship, a bond, our own peace." Anger may even be legitimate, but how we express it defines whether we are in control or still held captive. And this applies not only to anger, but to every emotion that without presence turns into noise. There is a simple yet transformative Stoic gesture, the pause. A second of silence before answering, a breath before deciding, an internal glance before any word. This small space can be the difference between repeating a cycle or starting a new one. Because true authenticity isn't saying everything we feel. It's choosing what, how, and when to say it. It's realizing that the center isn't in the impulse, but in the intention. And only those who learn not to react on autopilot discover the power to act with truth. A truth that doesn't shout. A truth that doesn't need to defend itself. A truth that, being silent, is profoundly liberating. 2. Seeking validation, disguised as connection. Sometimes what we call connection is just a disguised attempt to be seen. We want to be heard, but deep down, we hunger for acceptance. We seek contact, but often it is loneliness that speaks for us. And then we mold ourselves. We soften parts, hide others, dramatize what would make us more interesting. We do this without realizing, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of being forgotten, ignored, left behind. And it is in this place of insecurity that the habit of seeking validation is born, not for who we are, but for what we manage to elicit from others. We live in times where exposure has become synonymous with presence. The more we show, the more we believe we exist. But Stoicism teaches us that being present isn't about being seen, it's about being whole. And there is no wholeness when every gesture is calculated to make a good impression. Marcus Aurelius said, "Concern for the opinion of others is to forget who you are." And perhaps this is one of the deepest forms of self-abandonment, trying to fit into molds that were never made for us. Because in trying to please, we often stray from what we truly need to say, from who we truly are, even when that isn't popular, beautiful, or admired. This search for validation is treacherous because it disguises itself as care. We say we want to connect, but often we are just looking for confirmation that we are enough, that we belong, that we deserve. But when the need for validation overrides truth, the connection becomes a mask, and no relationship sustained by masks can last without becoming unhealthy. The Stoic doesn't ignore the desire for acceptance. They acknowledge it, but they don't feed it with illusion. They know that the only sustaining presence is that which is born from silence, from clarity, from the courage to be who you are, even if the world doesn't applaud. Before any display, there is a question that can change everything. Am I acting out of presence or out of lack? If it's out of presence, there will be peace, there will be firmness, there will be simplicity. If it's out of lack, anxiety, expectation, and demands will follow. And none of these sensations are signs of a real connection, because being with someone, or even with yourself, only has value when there's no need to pretend, when there's no performance, when there's no neediness disguised as dialogue. And this freedom, though difficult at first, is the only one that truly heals. To be stoic in this context is to have the courage to show up in your entirety, not edit. It is to allow what is essential in you to manifest without makeup, without the need to convince, without the desperation to be accepted. And ironically, that's where true connection is born, not from the attempt to be loved, but from the decision to remain whole, even when no one is looking. 3. Fleeing boredom, as if peace were uncomfortable. We live in a time where silence frightens, where pausing seems like a waste of time, where every moment without stimulation is filled with notifications, screens, short conversations that touch nothing real. We flee boredom as if it were a sign of failure, but perhaps boredom, that subtle discomfort we feel when the world slows down, is not our enemy. Perhaps it is an invitation to listen to what we ignore, to feel what we repress, to remember who we are when we are not trying to be anything else. The Stoic learns to endure the void, because it is in the void that the soul can finally be heard. When there's nothing left to do, nowhere to run, all that remains is who we are, and that for many is unbearable, because listening to what's inside requires courage to acknowledge weariness, longing, frustration, the truth that doesn't fit into ready-made phrases. And that's why we flee, because silence reveals, and what it reveals isn't always comfortable, but it's almost always necessary. Seneca said that boredom is the pain of those who do not know how to be with themselves. And this says a lot about our inability to simply exist, without proving, without producing, without interacting, just being, because we have learned that value lies in doing, that importance lies in impact. But Stoicism reminds us that virtue also lies in presence, in the quiet firmness of one who doesn't need distractions to endure themselves, of one who isn't afraid to be alone with their own body, their own thoughts, their own shadows. There is a simple and powerful ritual that can change this relationship with boredom. 10 daily minutes without stimulation, just you. A piece of paper, your breath, not to write something brilliant, not to meditate perfectly, but to simply be there, present, without haste, without a goal. Because it is in these intervals that the soul whispers, that the most sincere answers emerge, that peace ceases to be a concept and begins to be an experience. Fleeing boredom is ultimately fleeing from yourself, but no one can flee from themselves for long without getting lost. And losing yourself is the opposite of living with wholeness. The Stoic does not seek boredom, but neither do they fear it. They know that peace does not come from the absence of movement, but from reconciliation with their own silence. And this reconciliation begins the moment we stop seeing boredom as a threat and start seeing it as a mirror that reflects with tenderness and precision everything that still needs to be looked at and perhaps embraced. 4. Accumulating without purpose, even emotion. There's a type of accumulation that isn't seen, but weighs heavily. It settles in the shoulders, the chest, the stomach. We accumulate unspoken resentment, unfinished tasks, forgotten promise. We hold on to unreplied messages, unworn clothes, undigested memories, and we carry all of this as if it were natural, as if living were synonymous with storing. But accumulation is treacherous. It convinces us that we are prepared, when in fact we are merely overloaded. It makes us feel full, when inside there is no longer room to breathe. The Stoic observes what they carry and learns to let go, because dignity isn't about having much. It's about knowing what's worth keeping and what's past prime. This applies to objects, but it applies much more to emotion. How many grudges have you been dragging along for fear of appearing weak? How many relationships do you maintain solely for the dread of being alone? How many roles do you insist on playing to avoid facing the discomfort of no longer knowing who you are? Attachment to anything is a weight that slowly obscures the lightness the soul needs to be true. Epictetus said, "Don't say, 'I lost it.' Say, 'I returned it.'" This phrase carries a silent power because it reminds us that nothing truly belongs to us. Not people, not achievement, not even versions of ourselves. Everything that arrives can one day depart. And resistance to this truth creates suffering because we confuse love with possession, identity with roles, stability with control. But all of this is transient, and until we learn to return what has completed its cycle, we will continue accumulating more than we can sustain. With wholeness, letting go is not abandonment. It is care. It is a gesture of self-respect, an acknowledgement that living with purpose requires space, inner space, space for the new, space to feel deeply, without every emotion having to fight for attention. And this lightness is not achieved through effort. It is born from the silent choice to detach, to let go of what no longer serves. What hurts, yes, but hurts more if it stays. What was once shelter, but today only occupies the place of what has not yet had a chance to be born. The Stoic walks lightly because they choose with clarity, and this choice is made every day in how they speak, in what they tolerate, in what they decide to let go. Because those who accumulate out of fear end up living half-heartedly. But those who learn to let go, even through tears, open the way to a freedom that does not depend on circumstance, a freedom that comes from within. And that only blossoms when the heart finally learns to live with less, but with truth. 5. Judging others to avoid facing the mirror. Judgment doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it stems from pain, from the need to look away, to shift the focus outward so as not to confront what screams within. Judging others is often a defensive gesture, an unconscious attempt to keep distance from one's own mirror. We point out others' flaws because it's easier to deal with someone else's defect than to touch the silent wound we carry. But this ease is illusory, because the more we judge, the further we drift from ourselves. And the further we drift, the more lost we become within what we refuse to acknowledge. A Stoic doesn't judge. They observe. They observe to understand. They observe to take care of themselves, because they know that every external judgment is, in reality, information about their inner world. Seneca said, "He who occupies himself too much with the faults of others forgets his own." And forgetting one's own faults is the first step to repeating them. It's the beginning of arrogance disguised as reason. It's the moment when we exchange evolution for comparison. And no comparison heals, no comparison sustains. Every time we cast judgment, it's like throwing a stone into a lake. It doesn't sink alone. It comes back. It comes back in the form of ripples. It comes back in the form of tension. It comes back in the form of disguised guilt. Because deep down, we know there's something within us that needs to be seen, that needs to be cared for. And judgment, even if unconscious, is a dangerous shortcut. It protects us from the pain of facing who we are, but it also distances us from the possibility of transforming ourselves. And transformation requires truth, a truth without pretense, without spectacle, a silent but firm truth. Judging is easy. It only requires distance. It only requires a biased gaze. But observing demands present. It demands courage. It demands humility to say, this also exists in me. And this recognition is not weakness, it is strength, because those who recognize their shadows stop projecting them onto others. They stop living defensively, they stop reacting with bitter, and they begin to respond with compassion. A compassion that doesn't justify the error but understands the pain. A compassion that doesn't demand perfection but sustains the process. To be Stoic is to choose this path, the path that trades judgment for attentive silence, that trades empty criticism for intimate responsibility, that understands that every time we point a finger, we are revealing what has not yet been healed, and that healing only begins when we stop running, when we accept that the mirror, however uncomfortable it may be, is the only place where we can rediscover who we were and who we can still be. Being Stoic is not hardening, it is purifying. Perhaps the biggest mistake in trying to understand Stoicism is believing that it is a form of hardening, as if strength were synonymous with coldness, as if wisdom required forced silence, rigid restraint, indifference to pain. But the true Stoic does not flee from feeling. They merely purify what they feel. They acknowledge the emotion, observe the impulse, listen to the body, and then choose. They choose with calm. They choose with dignity. They choose with that firmness that does not hurt but sustain. Because being strong is not about never being shaken. It is knowing where to anchor yourself when your inner world trembles. Seneca said that virtue is a flame fed by consciousness, not denial. This means that Stoicism is not the end of emotion. It is the beginning of clarity. It is the practice of not being dominated, of not handing over the key to your own peace to anyone, of not reacting to the world as if it were responsible for everything we feel. Because the world does provoke, yes, but it is we who choose what to do with what it provokes. And it is in that space between stimulus and response that freedom resides, true freedom. The one that doesn't depend on circumstances or external control, but on intimacy with one's own consciousness. Epictetus reinforced. True freedom is internal, and this freedom begins when we stop betraying ourselves in small doses, when we stop repeating habits that sabotage our peace in the name of haste, vanity, validation, when we stop saying yes for fear of displeasing, when we stop accumulating pains, distraction, judgments, and little by little begin to say no, not with anger, not with rigidity, but with truth. A no that doesn't close doors, it opens paths. A no that says, not inside here anymore. What if the true path to strength is precisely this? Saying no to the small daily betrayals against ourselves, no to the rush that steals meaning, no to the silence that swallows pain, no to the unconscious repetition that exhausts us, no to a life lived only to appear strong when inside we just want to breathe in peace. Being Stoic is not wearing armor, it is learning to inhabit one's own body without fear, to sustain one's own silence without fleeing, to say with serenity and firmness, I choose what affects me, and from today forward, I choose with more presence. This is the call, not to be perfect, but to be whole, not to be immune, but to be free, because all true transformation begins with a look, and with the silent courage to say, enough. Enough of carrying what no longer serves, enough of forgetting who we are, enough of surviving when we can at last begin to live with truth, with wholeness, with soul.